I was browsing Reddit the other day when I came across this post. So the author had just started learning Korean. They were wondering if they should start playing video games in Korean using Korean voices and subtitles. And to make matters even worse, they hadn't really started to learn Hangul yet. Okay, yeah, I know it's Reddit, so take it all with a grain of salt, but I do think that this is an interesting question. I mean, at what point in time can you say that you know enough of a language to play a video game of that language? And is it legitimate to use video games as a language learning tool? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, I don't know every language in the world, and I know, like you know, that most role-playing video games are pretty Japanese-centric even to this day. But it might surprise you just where some linguistic ability might be useful. And it turns out that you can use video games to buttress your language learning even if you're not learning Japanese. In fact, Korean is a pretty good example. Though there aren't a whole ton of native Korean RPGs out there, there are a couple. The old 1993 DOS game Hongil Dongjeon is a good example. It's based on the old Korean story of Hongil Dong, which helps explain the title. And of course, it's a story that is uniquely Korean, or in other words, this is no translation from Japanese or English or whatever. Now, getting this game to actually work is another story. The version that I tried to use uses a copy protection scheme, and I couldn't find a copy of the manual anywhere. And so we'll unfortunately have to observe the game through still screenshots that I've found online. Of course, Hongil Dongjeon is not the only choice that we have. There was another very popular DOS game called Astonishia Story that came out in 1994, for example. Sadly, I couldn't get this one to work either. I could see some of the intro, but then the game crashed. Installing it didn't work either. If you want to know how to say please insert disc 1 in Korean, well, here you go. Fortunately, there is a PlayStation Portable port of this game, and it's absolutely fantastic. So everything in this version is in Korean, as you can see here. If you wanted to learn the language using this game, you would probably need to jot down some notes and have a dictionary handy. It's a fun game too, it's absolutely worth the effort. And of course, you probably should be taking notes anyway to figure stuff out in these RPGs, right? Assuming you're not cheating. That's the old Ultima tradition after all. You're supposed to be, drawing up maps and stuff like that, writing down what characters say, whatever. Anyway, Korean is not the only language with RPGs that are worth checking out for the purposes of learning language. There are a couple of good ones in Chinese as well. A website I found praised this game, Jingyong Chun Xiaozhuan, or Heroes of Jingyong. So this game came out on the PC in 1996, and you can actually play it for free on the Internet Archive. It's apparently based on the novels of the famous wuxia novelist Jin Yong, which means that it has a literary bend to it. But when you play the game, you'll see that it's a little bit too literary. I mean, they really go overboard with the text, most of which is intended to teach you what a role-playing game is and how to play it. I wound up wandering around aimlessly looking for a battle or a town that I could enter or for something interesting to happen. Anyway, it's a great game if you want to read a bunch of Chinese text in an ugly MS-DOS font. I didn't see enough action to determine whether the game itself was really good or not, though. But there are also other choices out there, especially if you're a fan of the old Famicom. As you may or may not know, about 20 years ago, a mainland Chinese company came out with hacked versions of advanced Final Fantasy games for the Famicom. Final Fantasy IV is actually a very faithful translation of the Super Nintendo version. Sure, there is a wall of text at the beginning. Once you get past that, though, you'll see things that will be quite familiar if you've played Final Fantasy IV. I'm not quite sure how the company did it, but they managed to figure out a way to get a large variety of Chinese characters to display on the old 8-bit hardware. In fact, the same company eventually came out with a port of Final Fantasy VII for the Famicom, which really has to be one of the most ambitious ports in video game history. Again, the whole game is translated into Chinese. Don't expect anything in 3D, of course, and I've read that there are parts of the story that had to be left out. Still, if you're serious about using Chinese to play a role-playing game, you really can't go wrong with either one of these. Of course, the problem is that those are Chinese translations of Japanese games and not native Chinese games. Now, I know that I should be talking about Genshin Impact and games like that, though I honestly haven't tried it yet, and I'm not really a big fan of the gacha games. I mean, I'm older, I'm probably more of an old school RPG fan. which leads me naturally to the Japanese games. Okay, you likely already know about the classics like the old NES Final Fantasy series. You almost certainly know about the Dragon Quest series as well. But what you might not know is that gamers have posted full copies of the scripts of those games on GameFAQs. This is actually really useful since the version this poster created includes kanji in addition to the original kana. You see, the NES really wasn't designed to display kanji, which means that you've got to know your kana really well to figure out what in the world is going on. I'm not sure if it's because I started with Chinese or what, but I do find it pretty difficult to figure out what's going on without the kanji. I also had a similar problem with Korean for years. The homonyms always give me problems. Anyway, you can find these scripts for Final Fantasy and the first 3 Dragon Quest games. If you're really interested in using video games to buttress your language learning, I strongly recommend starting with something like this. It's going to be a lot easier for you to figure out what's going on in the game if you've already looked up the words and you already understand the sentences. You do need to remember though that some of the spells and monster names are pretty game specific and probably won't help you learn the language in a broader sense. I mean, I guess that's sort of like an English learner studying phrases like hocus pocus or abracadabra. There are interesting stories behind those words and phrases, sure, but it's probably not going to be that practical in day-to-day life. But that doesn't mean that video games are totally useless. Well, like everything else pop culture related, video game language is helpful as long as you keep the language register in mind. It is still important to learn how to read newspapers, how to watch the news, and so on. However, it's much more important for you as a language learner to use your target language to do something that you actually enjoy. Even if you're a beginning student, you would be better off getting your nose out of the boring textbooks and just exploring the language. The truth is that your natural curiosity will not hurt anything. You won't somehow break your language learning abilities by having some fun. And the thing is that you really can jump in even if you are a true beginner, like an absolute beginner. I mean, why not? The worst thing that will happen is that you'll be confused, and then you can slowly figure out what's confusing you, you can learn about it, and then use that to actually learn the language. I mean, here I am translating Dream of the Red Chamber, I'm in the poetry section, I get confused all the time, and I do the same thing. I look at what's making me confused and figure it out, and then I learn it. Anyway, I say go for it. Focus your language learning on things that you actually like. You'll be a lot happier if you do.